Chicago in winter is a cruel thing, especially when the sky decides to spit freezing rain just as rush hour hits. By late afternoon, the city felt like it was under a sheet of smeared glass, headlights glowing dull and blurry, streets shimmering with that deceptive sheen that promises both beauty and a quick trip to the ER. Denise had been on her feet for almost 14 hours, double shift at St. Luke's, running mostly on burnt coffee and spite. She was halfway through planning the dinner she'd reheat in her microwave when the brake lights ahead of her lit up in a sickening ripple. At first it looked like just another fender bender, until the smoke started. She eased her aging Toyota onto the shoulder and saw the mess unfold. A chain reaction pileup stretched across 3 lanes, a jagged sculpture of steel and glass. Horns wailed. Somewhere up front, a woman screamed. Denise sat for half a second, tapping the steering wheel, calculating the odds. She wasn't a hero. She didn't run toward danger for fun. But she had one hardwired rule: if she could help, she did. The rest was just noise. She popped the trunk and yanked out her battered emergency kit, the same one she kept for roadside CPRs and the occasional drunk who decided to nap on a sidewalk. The air was sharp with the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber. People were milling around, some filming with their phones, others shouting conflicting instructions. Denise hated that chaos in place of action. She cut through it, scanning for the worst damage. That's when she saw it. Wedged between the rear of a jackknifed semi and the crumpled front of another, a silver Bentley looked like a millionaire's coffin. The roof had caved in at one side, the hood folded like a tin lid, and the driver was a dark shape slumped behind shattered glass. 2 men in reflective vests were trying to pry the door open, but the metal wouldn't budge. One of them shouted to her that it was a lost cause. They were waiting for the jaws of life. Denise didn't wait. She shoved her kit at the nearest onlooker, climbed over a mangled fender, and used the gap between the semi's trailer and the Bentley's side to wedge herself in. Her boots slipped on wet metal and freezing rain stung her face, but she kept going until she was right at the driver's window. Glass crunched under her knee. The man inside was conscious, barely. Blood trickled down from his hairline, his right hand gripping the steering wheel in a death claw, knuckles pale against leather. His suit jacket was torn and there was a cut on his cheekbone, the kind that bleeds enough to look worse than it is. He turned his head toward her, eyes glassy but alert enough to register her presence. "You?" His voice was hoarse, ragged. "Call on my lawyer." Denise blinked. "Yeah, sure. Let me just put that on my to-do list after I stop you from bleeding out." He tried to twist toward her, winced, and muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse aimed at the universe in general. She checked his airway, pulse, breathing, all there, but he was in shock, and the bent metal around his legs told her he wasn't getting out without help. The rain drummed harder, and every passing second meant more gasoline fumes filling the air. Somewhere behind her, someone yelled for everyone to step back. She ignored it. Sliding her arm through the broken window, she pressed gauze to his head wound. He flinched but didn't fight her. There was something about the way he looked at her. Not gratitude, not fear, just a mix of annoyance and entitlement that didn't fit the situation. Most people in a wreck would be begging for a medic or God or both. This guy was acting like she'd interrupted his board meeting. A truck horn blared nearby as first responders tried to maneuver through the mess. Denise kept her body low, her voice even. She told him to stay awake, to keep talking, though she doubted he'd tell her anything useful. In the distance, the high whine of rescue equipment kicked in. She could already picture the hydraulic cutters chewing through the Bentley's frame. For now, it was just her and him in that wet metal tomb. She didn't know his name and frankly she didn't care. But she knew enough to sense there was more to this than a simple highway accident. There was an edge to his words, a shadow in the way his gaze kept darting past her, like he was expecting someone else to arrive, someone he feared more than death by crushed luxury car. Denise adjusted the pressure on the gauze, felt the warmth seep through, and braced herself as the rescue crew got closer. Somewhere in the mess of sirens and shouted orders, she realized this wasn't just a save. This was the start of something she hadn't signed up for, and maybe couldn't walk away from. The first responders swarmed the scene like ants on a picnic, but Denise stayed locked in her position, one knee in broken glass, her gloved hand pressing the gauze into place. The man, who still hadn't bothered to thank her, was breathing a little steadier now, but his pulse had that jittery rhythm that told her he was running on adrenaline and ego. She kept her voice low and practical, the way you do with drunks, toddlers, and men who think they're in charge. His eyes flicked from her to the flashing lights in the distance, then back again as if assessing whether she was worth talking to. When a paramedic squeezed in beside her, she gave the quick rundown: head wound, possible rib fractures, leg trapped, vitals holding for now. The paramedic nodded and started prepping the collar. That's when the man finally spoke again, this time with the air of someone used to dictating terms. Tell them to be careful with the door. This car's custom. His voice had that polished, too many boardrooms tone, every word dipped in money. The paramedic didn't even glance at him, but Denise arched a brow. Yeah, we'll put that on the priority list right after keeping your heart beating. She didn't mean to sound sharp, but his attitude made it too easy. She'd dealt with trauma patients who were terrified, furious, or resigned. This guy was annoyed. Like the accident had inconvenienced his day planner. Then, as the rescue crew started cutting into the frame, one of the firefighters leaned toward her and muttered, "You know who that is, right?" Denise shook her head. The firefighter smirked without humor. Mason Whitmore. The guy who kicked all those vets out of the Franklin building last year. Said he was redeveloping it. Put up that ugly tower instead. She remembered the news stories, angry tenants on the sidewalk, reporters chasing a tall man in an overcoat, protest signs that read, "Whitmore equals slumlord." Denise's stomach tightened. She'd thought the Bentley was just a rich guy's toy. Now she realized the man inside was practically a villain of the 6 o'clock news. The firefighter's voice dropped. Some folks might just let him rot in there. Then he stepped back to work. Denise didn't reply, but the thought hit hard. She'd patched up gang members who'd just been arrested, treated people who'd spit on her as soon as they could talk. You don't get to pick the souls you save. That was the deal. Still, she couldn't help the flicker of satisfaction at seeing him pinned under his own chrome and leather empire. While the hydraulic cutters screamed, Mason decided now was the time to talk. "You're a nurse?" he asked like it was a surprise someone in scrubs might know what they were doing. She confirmed it with a curt nod. "Well, you're wasting your time in that hellhole of a hospital. You want real money, you work for people like me." She almost laughed. "You offering me a job while your legs are stuck under 2 tons of truck?" His lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "I'm saying people like you deserve better. And people like me, we make it happen. Charity cases are nice, but they don't buy you a retirement." Her blood ran hot for a second, but she bit down on the retort that wanted to fly out. He wasn't going to get under her skin. She had gauze, gloves, and a very short list of acceptable arguments right now, and he didn't make the cut. The door finally gave with a metallic shriek, and the crew slid in a backboard. Denise helped stabilize his neck as they shifted him out, every movement slow and deliberate. He winced once, muttered something about his lawyer again, and kept scanning the crowd like he was looking for a camera. She stepped back as they loaded him into the ambulance, already feeling the cold sting through her wet clothes. Before anyone could ask her for a statement, she grabbed her kit and slipped away, ducking between stalled cars until she reached her Toyota. She didn't want her face in whatever circus was about to follow this man. She drove home in silence, the wipers struggling against the freezing rain, her mind replaying his tone, his words, and the firefighter's comment about letting him rot. She'd saved plenty of people she didn't like, but something about him stuck in her craw. It wasn't until later, sitting on her couch in sweatpants with a reheated burrito, that she realized she hadn't escaped the circus at all. The TV was on for background noise, but the local anchor's voice made her look up. There it was, footage from the crash site. Flames in the background, flashing lights, and her, crouched at the driver's side of that mangled Bentley. The camera angle caught her helping him to the gurney, her face grim and focused. The cheer-in read, "Local nurse saves Mason Whitmore." She stared at the screen, burrito forgotten. Now she wasn't just a tired woman who'd stopped to help at an accident. She was the nurse who'd saved one of the most hated men in Chicago, and that, she suspected, was going to be its own kind of trouble. By the next morning, Denise's phone felt like it was vibrating straight into her bones. Texts, voicemails, Facebook messages from people she hadn't talked to since high school. Half were congratulations from old friends or former patients who saw her on the news and wanted to say she was a hero. The other half were less friendly. Strangers calling her a sellout for helping the enemy, as if she'd personally endorsed everything Mason Whitmore had ever done. Someone even sent her a link to an opinion piece that described her as the nurse who saved the slumlord. She'd never been the center of attention, and she hated every second of it. At the hospital it was worse. Her coworkers couldn't resist. The ER doc she'd worked with for years greeted her with, "Hey, celebrity, you taking autographs now?" A couple of nurses joked about getting her a gold-plated stethoscope since she was apparently in with the rich and infamous. But under the ribbing there was something else, a quiet respect from a few of them. One of the older techs, a woman who'd seen her share of ugly cases, just patted Denise's arm and said, "Takes guts to run into twisted metal like that. Doesn't matter who was inside." That stuck with her more than the teasing. By mid-afternoon she was ready to throw her phone into Lake Michigan. She'd just finished restocking a supply cart when it rang again, number blocked. Normally she'd let it go to voicemail, but something made her swipe to answer. A calm, polished voice introduced herself as Caroline, Mason Whitmore's assistant. Mason wanted to see her, privately, to thank her in person. The way she said it made it sound less like an invitation and more like a calendar appointment with a man who was used to getting his way. Denise's first instinct was to say no. She didn't need another headline or photo op. But curiosity had a way of winning arguments in her head. She said she'd think about it, and 2 hours later she was standing in front of a high-rise in the Gold Coast, staring up at glass and steel worth more than she'd make in 10 lifetimes. The penthouse was a different planet. Marble floors, art that probably cost more than her car, a skyline view that made the city look like a toy. Mason was in a wheelchair, one arm in a cast, dressed in a cashmere sweater that probably wasn't off the rack. He didn't look fragile. He looked like a man irritated that his body had dared to slow him down. Caroline disappeared without a word, leaving them alone in a living room big enough to host a wedding reception. For a moment neither spoke. Then Mason gestured toward a sleek envelope on the coffee table. "That's for you. Call it hazard pay." Denise didn't touch it. "I don't invoice God's work." She kept her voice flat like she was just stating a policy. He tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he hadn't decided was worth solving. Then he laughed, not the warm belly kind but short and surprised. "You're the first person to say no to me in, hell, I can't remember how long. Maybe you need more people like me then?" "Maybe I don't," he shot back, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes that didn't match his words. The conversation limped along after that, an awkward mix of polite thanks and little jabs that neither of them seemed able to resist. She asked how his recovery was going. He deflected with a complaint about hospital food. He asked if she'd gotten grief for saving him. She shrugged and said, "More than usual, but nothing I can't handle." Underneath, there was a tug of war, his arrogance bumping up against her refusal to play by his rules. Before she left, he tried once more to press the envelope on her. She told him to give it to one of the tenants he'd displaced. His smile vanished at that, replaced with a look she couldn't quite read, part annoyance, part respect? Maybe. She wasn't about to overthink it. In the elevator down, Denise caught her reflection in the mirrored wall. She didn't look like a hero, just a tired nurse in scrubs and a thrift store coat. But she had the strange feeling she'd just stepped into a story that wasn't finished. Mason Whitmore was trouble. Rich, infuriating, unapologetic trouble, and something told her their paths hadn't crossed for the last time. The weeks that followed were quieter on the surface, but Denise could feel Mason orbiting her life in little, irritating ways. A bouquet of exotic flowers arrived at the nurse's station with her name on the card and no signature, but the handwriting was a dead giveaway. She sent them straight to the waiting room. 2 days later, a box of gourmet chocolates showed up at her apartment with a typed note, "For your trouble." She gave the box to her neighbor's kids. He wasn't subtle and he clearly didn't like hearing no, but she made sure every gift boomeranged right back to him, sometimes with a sticky note that just said try harder. Then came the headlines. Mason Whitmore, once untouchable, was suddenly the prime target of every business reporter in Chicago. Local news ran grainy footage of him ducking into courthouses, national outlets speculated on indictments. The words fraud and embezzlement were getting cozy with his name. One particularly nasty article quoted anonymous sources claiming he'd siphoned money from redevelopment funds meant for veterans. Denise read it twice, not because she doubted it, but because she couldn't decide whether the smirk she felt creeping onto her face made her a terrible person. It was a Thursday night when the call came. She almost didn't answer, number blocked again, but the voice on the other end was raw, unpolished, stripped of its usual armor. "Denise? I need help." There was no preamble, no fake charm. Just a thin thread of panic. He said he couldn't go to a hospital. Couldn't trust anyone. Needed her to come. She sat there, phone pressed to her ear, weighing every reason to stay home. He was a grown man with resources she couldn't dream of. He could buy a doctor to make house calls. And yet, there was something in his voice, a crack she hadn't heard before, that made it hard to hang up. She told herself she was just checking to make sure he wasn't bleeding out on a kitchen floor. That was it. The Gold Coast penthouse looked different at night, shadows swallowing the polish, the air heavy and still. She let herself in with the code Caroline had given her weeks ago. The first thing she saw was paper, envelopes, thick legal folders, all unopened, scattered like fallen leaves across the marble floor. Then she found him. Mason was half slumped against the kitchen island, skin pale, hair a mess, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt that looked like it had cost more than her rent but still couldn't make him look like the man from the news. His breathing was shallow, his forehead damp. She went straight into triage mode, check pulse, check airway, scan for obvious trauma. His vitals were shaky, dehydration obvious. As she coaxed him onto a stool and got some electrolyte solution into him, he muttered without looking at her, "It's not dying I'm scared of." His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "It's disappearing. Being nothing. Being forgotten." Denise kept her hands busy, bandaging a shallow cut on his arm. "You keep living like a parasite, that's exactly where you're headed. People will remember you, sure, but only as a cautionary tale." She didn't soften it. He didn't hire her to be his PR team, and even if he had, she'd have quit on day one. He gave a dry laugh that turned into a cough. "You're not great at bedside comfort." "I'm not here to comfort you," she said, taping the last of the bandage in place. "I'm here because you called and said you needed help. That's it. Whatever's going on with your empire or your enemies or your fear of the grave, that's your mess." He finally looked at her, and for a moment the arrogance was gone. There was just a man, tired, cornered, stripped of his armor. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing either. She couldn't tell if the cracks she saw were the start of redemption or just the desperation of someone watching the walls close in. She left him with clear instructions on hydration and rest, fully aware he'd probably ignore half of them. On the elevator ride down, she caught herself wondering why she'd gone at all. Maybe because, for all his faults, Mason had finally spoken to her like she was a person, not a prop. Or maybe because she knew what it was to fear being forgotten. Either way, she had the sinking feeling that this was far from their last round. A month later, the envelope arrived looking like trouble dressed up in legal stationery. The return address was a downtown law firm, the kind that billed by the minute and smelled like mahogany. Denise sat at her kitchen table staring at it for a solid 5 minutes before sliding a knife under the flap. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper. Mason Whitmore, it said in polite lawyer speak, had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 days earlier. No funeral notice, no public service. The words per his instructions were sprinkled throughout like salt. He had left something for her and it was enclosed. The enclosed item was another envelope, this one unmarked and sealed in thick cream paper. A small sticky note in the lawyer's tidy handwriting read, "Mr. Whitmore requested you open this privately." Denise turned it over in her hands, tempted to toss it in the junk drawer with old birthday cards and appliance manuals. Instead she broke the seal. The handwriting inside was messy but deliberate, the kind of script you get from a man who signs more checks than letters. "Denise," it began, "I never claimed to be a good man. I still don't. I probably left this world about as flawed as I entered it, but there's a short list of people I respected, and you're on it. You didn't want my money, so I'm leaving you something else, something that will outlast both of us. I've transferred ownership of a small apartment building to you. It's nothing fancy, but it's paid off and it's yours. Figure you'd make a better landlord than most of the vultures in this damn city. Do whatever you want with it. Maybe keep it decent. That'd be a nice change." She read it twice, then once more, trying to decide if this was guilt, penance, or just Mason's strange way of closing a tab in his mental ledger. There was an address, one she vaguely recognized from a neighborhood she'd driven through but never stopped in. She grabbed her coat and keys before she could talk herself out of it. The building sat on a corner, 3 stories of tired brick and peeling paint. The iron railings were rusted, the front steps sagged a little in the middle, and the lobby smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. But it wasn't falling apart and it was far from empty. Kids darted past her on the sidewalk, their laughter sharp in the cold air. An older woman shuffled out with a grocery bag, giving Denise a curious glance but no challenge. Inside, the mailboxes told their own story, names in marker, peeling labels, mismatched locks. She met a tenant on the 2nd floor, a man in work boots and a paint-splattered jacket. He looked her up and down when she introduced herself as the new owner, then said bluntly, "Rent's due next week. It's always been fair. Don't change that and we're good." Fair. It wasn't a word she associated with Mason's business practices, but maybe that was the point. She spent the afternoon walking the halls, taking notes on repairs, chatting with whoever was home. The stories were similar: fixed incomes, shift work, families making it work on tight budgets. They didn't need a savior. They needed someone who wouldn't gut the place and triple the rent. By the time she left, her decision was made. The building would stay affordable. She'd hire someone local for repairs, keep the lights on, fix what was broken. It wasn't charity. It was just decent. Something she could live with. That night, back at her apartment, Denise sat with a mug of tea, the letter spread out on the table. Mason hadn't asked for forgiveness. He hadn't earned it. But he'd left her a chance to do something he never had, give without taking. Maybe it was redemption in his own warped way. Maybe it was just a final move in whatever game he'd been playing. Either way, it was hers now. She thought about the first time she'd seen him, bleeding in that twisted Bentley, barking about his lawyer while she tried to keep him alive. She'd saved him then because she could, not because he deserved it. That hadn't changed. She smiled faintly, folded the letter, and slid it into a drawer. You don't save people because they deserve it. You save them because you can. The rest, well, sometimes the rest surprises you. And sometimes, it changes more than just the person you pulled out of the wreckage. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.